How do we build a just city, a good city, in what is also a great city? This story is about Battersea, the Red Rose, and the quest to find a good life for all its residents. The entire area forms a roughly triangular wedge within southwest London. North Battersea is low-lying, built upon marshy land by the Thames as it winds towards the sea from Battersea Reach, past Battersea Church, where William Blake, the poet of Jerusalem, was married, past Battersea Park and the power station, and on to Nine Elms, while South Battersea is on higher ground. Its houses sprawl up and over the shoulder of Lavender Hill and march south, next to Clapham Common, where there's a plaque to Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, who launched from here the worldwide campaign to abolish slavery, and on to Balham, famously known to all Peter Sellers fans as Balham Gateway to the South.
Balham, Gateway to the South. We enter Balham through the verdant grasslands of Battersea Park, and at once we are aware that here is a land of happy, contented people who go about their daily tasks in truly democratic spirit. This is busy High Street, focal point of the town's activity. Note the quaint old stores whose frontage is covered with hand-painted inscriptions, every one a rare example of native Balham art.
And Sellers knew what he was joking about. Battersea is indeed crisscrossed with main railways and major roads, taking people into and out of London from all points across South and Southwest England.
But our story is not just about the swathe of London that became the metropolitan borough of Battersea. It's also the story of a political organisation, Battersea Labour Party, which began in the heartlands of the industrial borough 100 years ago and is still going strong. Even before the First World War, the political left in Battersea had produced Britain's first working-class cabinet minister, and Britain's first black mayor, and a pioneering Anglo-Irish feminist who spent her youth writing romantic novels and then turned herself into a political firebrand. And immediately after the war, the Battersea workers elected the man who remains Britain's one and only Asian communist MP, who won his seat with Labour endorsement. This is the story that is traced here. It shows how the Battersea Labour Party has changed Battersea, and how the Battersea Labour Party has itself changed with Battersea.
Above all, it is the story of thousands of local people who got involved. The Battersea Party in the last 100 years has probably enrolled over 50,000 members. The activists meet monthly in what used to be smoky committee rooms to carry out the unglamorous work of party organisation. This small group is holding the half-unfolded motto of the old Battersea Borough Council: "Not for me, not for you, but for us." The ideal is that of forging a community. A number of the Battersea Party activists have gone on to become elected councillors, some also to be MPs, and one has become Prime Minister. At any rate, all political leaders are sustained by their grassroots supporters. Leaders who get too far out of step with their party members cannot survive for long. Just as, to be successful, political parties must ultimately stay in step with the voters too.
In fact, when the National Labour Party was launched in 1906, the Labour organisation in Battersea was at odds with the national leadership, and Labour locally did not affiliate to the National Party until 1908. That's why Red Battersea has its own centenary in 2008, telling its own story in its own way.
It all began with a surge of intensive settlement in the days of Queen Victoria. Old Battersea Village, situated close to the majestic bend of the River Thames that Turner loved to paint, was transformed into the new industrial Battersea. Thousands moved into the area. The marshes, fields and market gardens were replaced by factories, gasworks, railway lines and intensive housing. Look at the 19th century vista of boggy Nine Elms marshland. On the horizon there is an encroaching line of buildings, while the trudging parent and child are proxies for the new workforce, arriving from across England, especially from nearby Surrey and Sussex, but also, and in some numbers, from Ireland. The 9 great elms that gave the area its name were soon to go under the axe, and only very recently have replacements been planted by the riverside. People and jobs took priority, and by 1901 there were almost 170,000 residents crammed into Battersea, well over double the population of today. The new housing was very varied in standard. In South Battersea there were many respectable streets with terraces built in South London's light yellow brick and often with attractive design details. Here lived middling people, like shopkeepers, traders, clerks, all working in London's commercial and service sector. In North Battersea, by contrast, many houses rented by the industrial workers were poky and jam-packed with people. Some had running water in the kitchens, which were warmed by coal fires, but others had only standpipes in the streets or courtyards.
The hectic development can be seen in 2 contrasting maps. In 1870, the area just north of Lavender Hill contained some houses, but also open fields, orchard and nurseries where lavender and asparagus were grown commercially. A generation later, things are quite different. Buildings everywhere. Nearby, there are the compact but sturdy houses of the Shaftesbury estate, built in the 1870s by a builders' cooperative inspired by the reforming ideals of Lord Shaftesbury. But there was also an instant slum in the old Culvert Place, now demolished. Here, a small street of 24 houses was built on a tiny patch of land between 3 intersecting railway lines, at the mercy of the vibrations and the noise and the soot of the passing steam trains. Everything happened in a great rush, and the old village institutions were overwhelmed. But the people who came to Battersea were not willing to live on the wild frontier. Very quickly, they began to organise. Their trade unions campaigned to cut the excessively long working week, over 54 hours in Battersea's first factories. The skilled engineers led the way, but before long the railwaymen, the gas workers and the bricklayers were doing the same. Look at the confidence of the bricklayers' union banner, and the 2 linked hands to show solidarity between the workers. Organisation allowed people to campaign on issues in a way that individuals on their own could not. In 1884, a branch of the Social Democratic Federation, Britain's first communist party, was established in Battersea. Very quickly, the new party got its members elected onto the local vestry. And the communists argued successfully that Battersea needed not a village vestry, but its own town hall.
So began the quest to forge a good city for all its citizens. But how was that to be done? By and large, the trade unionists fought for immediate changes to ameliorate their hard-working conditions. They addressed each other as brothers, and later, when women joined the movement, they were termed, a little more gingerly, sisters. The radical socialists, however, called each other comrade, and hoped for a revolutionary transformation of the entire capitalist system. In Battersea, before the First World War, these rival strategies were represented by 2 larger-than-life personalities.
John Burns began as a firebrand supporter of the famous 1889 London dock strike, fighting for the 8-hour working day. With his big resonant voice, he became a famous orator at the big open-air mass meetings for left-wing causes. But Burns quickly decided that the best pathway was to deliver practical help to the people of Battersea. He was ambitious, both for himself and for his fellow citizens. "Now I do know what I want. I want to be the tribune of Battersea, to represent it on the governing body of London, to sit for it in the House of Commons, and after that, who knows?" It was an optimistic dream for the 16th son of a dirt-poor family from the seedy South London slums, a family struggling on the margins since Burns's father, a Scottish fitter, had deserted his wife and children. And the remarkable thing was that John Burns achieved his ambition. At first he joined the Communists. In 1889, however, Burns founded a new party named the Battersea Labour League. It was, in fact, the first Labour party anywhere in the country, campaigning not for ultimate revolution, but for practical reforms in the here and now. Burns got himself elected as Battersea's representative on the new London County Council. It should be noted that in those days politicians got no pay for undertaking such civil duties. But Burns was able to manage because his party set up a wages fund, giving him a modest salary. He then became Battersea's first Labour MP, winning the 1892 election with broad left support from the local Communists and Liberals, as well as his own Labour League. Burns was then 34. Once catapulted into national politics, John Burns began to mix with the good and the great. The Liberal leaders like Asquith thought him a pretty sound sort of chap. Burns supported the parliamentary Lib-Lab alliance, and the Liberals returned the compliment. In 1906, Burns was the first working-class hero to be invited to join the British cabinet. In fact, he became president of the local government board, and he tried to bring in nationally the sort of municipal improvements that his Labour League was implementing locally in Battersea. But reforming the entire country without a national base of cross-party alliances proved to be an intractable task.
John Burns was rightly known as the political colossus of Battersea, but his lifestyle remained simple. He travelled to Parliament by bicycle, he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he was a vegetarian. His hobby was playing cricket in the park and collecting books about London history. His local power base was the Battersea Labour League, but Burns deliberately allied with other groups. On the new Battersea Borough Council after 1900, his supporters held power with the Liberals in what they called the Progressive Alliance, a sort of popular front of its day. So when in 1906 the National Labour Party was founded, Burns kept his distance. That was also the moment when the Battersea Trades and Labour Council was ejected from the National Labour Network for supporting Burns and the Progressive Alliance. Burns's independent pathway, however, came to an abrupt end in 1914. He opposed the war and resigned from government. It proved to be his swan song. In 1918, the Battersea branch of the Labour Party did interview him for his selection as its parliamentary candidate. But he would not accept the National Party whip. He was too used to ruling his own roost. By this time, Burns was 64. He retired to his big house overlooking Clapham Common, where he lived for many years, awaiting the recall to power that never came. So John Burns became the first of Battersea Labour's lost leaders.
The person who became the Labour candidate for Battersea North in 1918 was equally remarkable. Her name was Charlotte Despard. She personified the other strand in Labour thinking, the strand that was not willing to compromise. Despard was a tall, thin, self-effacing woman, nurtured within an upper-class Anglo-Irish family, who became a revolutionary socialist, a suffragette, and a supporter of Irish nationalism. She was sent to Holloway Prison twice as a militant campaigner for votes for women, so it was a fine moment in 1918 when Despard became one of the first women ever to stand for Parliament. The Battersea Labour Party hoped that she would appeal to the newly enfranchised women voters, not just through female solidarity, but because Charlotte Despard was already celebrated in the constituency as a very practical do-gooder. In her early years, she had lived a pretty conventional life and wrote romantic novels. But in 1890, newly widowed, she moved to Battersea's Nine Elms district. Its dire and desperate poverty stirred her to become a political activist. So Despard funded and ran her own health clinic, as well as a soup kitchen and a youth club. She got herself elected to the Poor Law Guardians and fought to improve conditions in the workhouse. And she pressurised the school board to provide free school meals. Alongside everything else, Charlotte Despard funded a public hall for political meetings, and she later gave funds to the Battersea Labour Party, which had been affiliated to the National Party after 1908, so that it could set up its own headquarters on Lavender Hill. After all this, it was a distinct letdown when Charlotte Despard lost the election in 1918. Her platform was very radical, calling for better housing, better education, better nutrition for children, land nationalisation, and a minimum wage for all workers. But it was especially her pacifist opposition to the World War that deterred the voters, who were euphoric with Britain's recent victory. The local Lib-Lab Progressive Alliance collapsed, and the Liberals swung support to the successful Conservative. Did John Burns smile grimly? He had warned the local party. After that, the by now venerable Charlotte Despard never stood for Parliament again. But her zeal never flagged, and by the end of her long life, she had given away all her money to support Battersea radicalism, Irish nationalism, and later Soviet communism. The political defeat of another Battersea Labour leader did not, however, halt the movement locally. In the municipal elections in 1919, Labour won with a huge landslide, taking over 75% of all the votes cast in North Battersea. Many of the old Labour League had, by now, joined the National Party. Together, they sang the Labour anthem, The Red Flag, which was written by an Irishman from South London. Sure, the words about our martyred dead are way over the top, but that's not the point. It's poetic, not literal. Despard and the activists wanted to fly the people's flag in Battersea. And yes, that's just it. We'll keep the red flag flying here.
Throughout the years after 1900, Battersea Borough Council was in the vanguard of left-wing politics, not just in words but in deeds. Its motif was the bee. Bee for Battersea and for the insect's natural sense of community. For all but 6 years of its entire history, Battersea Council was run by Labour, and Labour in the Lib-Lab Progressive Alliance. And it became the new mecca of municipal intervention, updating Joe Chamberlain's gas and water socialism of Victorian Birmingham. In Battersea, the council provided housing, schools, public baths, parks and libraries. In addition, it ran its own electricity generating station, and it organised its own direct works department, employing its own building workforce to ensure good quality work and fair wages for the brickies. The first and most famous example of their work was the Latchmere Estate, dating from 1903. It was the first council housing anywhere in Britain to be constructed by direct labour. Every dwelling had an indoor bathroom and got its electricity from the council. With a recreation ground at its heart, the estate was described as a sanitary oasis in a wilderness of jerry-built houses. And close at hand was the council's new-built Latchmere Baths, with its Olympic-sized swimming pool. Labour in Battersea wanted to raise people's aspirations by giving them local facilities that were easily accessible. But the Battersea activists also saw themselves as part of an international movement.
Take the case of John Archer, Britain's first Afro-Caribbean Irish mayor. He was born in Liverpool, the son of a West Indian father and an Irish mother. When he moved to London, Archer worked as a photographer in a shop in Battersea Park Road. He also became a Battersea councillor as part of the Progressive Alliance. And in 1913, after a tense vote, he was chosen as the borough's mayor by 40 votes to 39. John Archer reassured the public in a wry acceptance speech.
I am a Lancastrian, born and bred, and my mother belonged to one of the greatest races on the face of the earth. My mother was an Irish woman, so there's not much of the foreigner about me after all.
Nonetheless, John Archer and his wife Bertha, who was Afro-Canadian, were well aware that they were pioneers. Archer saw his election as mayor as Battersea's blow against racial prejudice, telling those who voted for him,
"You have made history tonight."
Red Battersea, within the capital city of the British Empire, was a good base from which to attack imperialism and ethnic discrimination. Archer became a leading member of the African Progress Union, an international body that sought to liberate Africans and the descendants of Africans everywhere. His own year as Battersea's mayor in 1913 was overshadowed by the World War which followed, but the campaigns continued.
The political activists with working-class backgrounds were driven by an almost missionary zeal to end such poverty and deprivation. Another remarkable figure in the Battersea Party had also emerged from the South London slums. Stephen Sanders was sent out to work at the age of 11 as a farm boy. But somehow he managed to educate himself, and he became John Burns's party organiser, holding the Progressive Alliance together. Sanders also joined many famous left-wing intellectuals by writing some pamphlets for the Fabian Society. And his organisational abilities were such that he became the Society's General Secretary between 1913 and 1920. His special interest was the improvement of workers' pay and conditions. And that led him, in 1920, to a job in the International Labour Office of the new League of Nations. The international dimension of local politics was proved by the surprise choice of the next Labour candidate for Battersea North in the parliamentary election of 1922. He was Shapurji Sakladvala, an Indian and a communist, and he won the seat. He was not Britain's first Asian MP, but remains its only Asian communist MP. It was John Archer and other local activists in the Indian Workers' Welfare League who persuaded Battersea Labour to endorse Sakladvala, a dignified man from a wealthy Indian industrialist family and a fiery speaker for left-wing causes. And it was Archer who ran the winning election campaign, while Charlotte Despard appeared with Sakladvala to give a public endorsement.
Sakladvala's ethnic identity was certainly raised as an issue. Provocatively, one Conservative spokesman announced in a public meeting, with Sakladvala sitting next to him,
"I have to confess to having an instinctive preference for an Englishman."
But the crowd instantly heckled him with shouts of "Withdraw! Shame! You're asking for it!" And wittily, "What about Lady Astor?" That was a clever reference to the Conservative MP for Plymouth, who was not an Englishman, but an American woman. In 1923, Sakladvala lost the seat briefly, but he regained it in 1924. He was an assiduous MP, speaking eloquently for improvements at home and against imperialism overseas. During the general strike in May 1926, the broad labour movement in Battersea gave strong support to the striking miners, as did Sakladvala. Indeed, he was briefly thrown into jail for some allegedly seditious words at a rally. And he stated melodramatically, "I am out for revolution and am prepared to be shot down for it."
But that was too much. The National Labour Party was already becoming hostile to communists and had banned them from becoming members. Labour in Battersea argued against this decision. It stood by the personally popular Sakladvala. So, in February 1926, the National Party expelled Battersea Labour, for the second time in its short history. The first time the Trades Council in 1906 for allying with the Liberals, the second time Battersea Labour in 1926 for allying with the Communists. Nevertheless, the impasse did not last for long. It was revealed that Saklatvala was arguing within the Communist Party for the destruction of the Labour. His local following ebbed away. Battersea Labour Party reconstituted itself and returned to the national fold. In 1929, it nominated the mild-mannered Stephen Sanders as the official Labour candidate for Battersea North against the fiery Saklatvala. John Archer now campaigned against his former ally. Feelings ran high. Sanders won, and Saklatvala came third, collapsing with a heart seizure when he heard the news, as his daughter later testified. His prediction that the Communists would win 30 seats, including his own, had failed. So another leader of Battersea's broad Labour movement, the man who once addressed the Speaker in the House of Commons as Comrade Speaker, had also come and gone.
This is the army, Mr. Jones.
Throughout the 30s, there was much hardship, though Battersea never depended upon just one business, unlike the single industry towns in the north. In fact, there were some new jobs in the area, such as building the ungainly but utterly unmistakable Battersea Power Station, designed by Giles Gilbert Scott. Politically, the Battersea Party membership campaigned against unemployment and against fascism. On this 1933 protest march along the London Embankment can be seen the banner of the Battersea Trades Council's Unemployed Association, with its urgent message, "We demand work or maintenance." And here, further back in the throng, is the optimistic banner of the South Battersea Labour Party, slogan, "Socialism, the hope of the world." International issues were well to the fore, and Stephen Sanders, who regained Battersea North for Labour in 1935, gave strong support to the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War.
The real test for Battersea, however, was not the tensions of the 1930s, but its wartime battering in the 1940s. The German bombers were trying to destroy the heavy industries by the river, including the new power station. And they especially targeted the busy railway station, where the Victoria, Waterloo and Olympia lines intersect and crisscross. Overall, the wartime bombardment destroyed some 2,500 Battersea houses outright, and it damaged a colossal 26,000. That meant that virtually no property was without some adverse effect, either major or minor. People found it horribly disorientating when places they had known all their lives were reduced to rubble. The crisis, however, stimulated great community spirit. During the Blitz, people spent the nights in communal street shelters, or they walked across the common to climb down into the underground at Clapham Common Station, or they sat in improvised bolt holes under the stairs or in garden shelters. For the very young, it was even an adventure. In one big communal shelter, an enterprising local resident brought his cineprojector to cheer people up with Mickey Mouse cartoons. His son, then a bemused 3-year-old, remembered the films and also going out at night to admire the raking searchlights, which seemed to be like a giant firework display. Extensive though the damage was, Battersea's industries and its railways were not halted, although some strategically crucial industrial processes were moved out of London. Women were also drafted into the workforce. And in Battersea there was at least no shortage of coal, which was supplied by river. But people did begin to weary of the rationing of food and clothing, as well as the dirt and shabbiness and general uncertainty.
So the peace celebrations in 1945 were greatly enjoyed, with parades, street parties and bonfires. Some bomb sites were rebuilt quickly, but others were still wastelands 20 years later. And the emergency prefabricated houses, like these Queenstown Road prefabs, were also slow to be removed.
The reforming policies of Attlee's Labour government post-1945 was supported locally by not one but two Labour MPs from Battersea. In the wartime years, the Battersea North MP was Francis Campbell Ross Douglas, later Lord Barloch. He, however, was dispatched by Attlee to become Governor of Malta. The ensuing by-election in 1946 was won by Douglas Jay, later Lord Jay of Battersea, and the partner seat of Battersea South, a previous Tory stronghold except briefly in 1929-31, had already been won by Labour in 1945. Its new MP, sponsored by the Labour and Co-op parties together, was the 66-year-old Caroline Ganley, another of Battersea Labour's remarkable women. She came from Plymouth, the quiet daughter of a well-to-do tailor, and like Charlotte Despard before her, Ganley was radicalised by her discovery of urban poverty. She worked hard to improve Battersea's healthcare services, especially for working-class mothers and their underfed children. Ganley became, in turn, a Battersea and an LCC councillor, and then, as the MP for Battersea South, she was proud and happy to support the Attlee government's creation of the National Health Service. Caroline Ganley was a real team player, so when she lost her seat in 1951, at the age of 72, she was no lost leader. Instead, she diligently served as a local councillor for another 13 years. She loved the role, and she loved Battersea. Her name now adorns a small plain council block on the Winstanley estate. That's better than nothing, but Caroline Ganley really deserves a better monument for her many years of service.
Meanwhile, Battersea was gaining a new reputation not for its slums, but for the new festival gardens created for the 1951 Festival of Britain. The choice of Battersea Park was inspired. It recalled the historic leisure sites along London's South Bank, from Shakespeare's Globe to the 18th century Vauxhall Gardens, and to the old Battersea Fields, where the Red House pub had a time-honoured reputation for raffish fun. Now the festival gave Battersea Park a full facelift. The wartime allotments and pig pens went, in came floral gardens, a fun fair, a miniature railway, a chiming clock, and a tree walk with great views of the river. The old air raid shelters were rather implausibly transformed into restaurants. And the people came. In fact, the festival gardens became known as a lover's rendezvous, as popularised in the 1954 hit song by Petula Clark, Meet Me in Battersea Park. A little later, the local Conservatives proposed to close the leisure facilities on grounds of cost. But Labour voted to keep them open, and the fun fair survived until 1974. The people of Battersea acquired in the course of things a reputation for guile and bounciness, a theme highlighted in one of the best of the post-war films from Ealing Studios. Starring Alec Guinness and Stanley Holloway, the Lavender Hill mob does not show much of the real Battersea, but all the same, it made Lavender Hill famous.
Waking us all up at this hour.
Another film, meanwhile, does show evocative views of the riverside in its run-down days. In The Optimists of Nine Elms, two youngsters, played by unknowns from the Battersea Council estates, befriend a down-and-out street busker. He is played by Peter Sellers, with a new nose. And he gives a riveting performance that drew upon his own family background in vaudeville. Optimism was a useful resource. The author Nell Dunn, who moved to Battersea from her affluent Chelsea home, wrote a series of sketches called Up the Junction. They featured sexy young working-class women whose life options were clearly limited. But they were cheerfully stoical. Have a laugh, go out for a drink, fancy a bloke, and who knows.
3 browns, please.
3 browns, Tol. Don't worry, girls, I'll be back. Seen you before, haven't we?
Might have done.
You come from Battersea, don't you?
Yes, right. Well, we do. She don't know. She's from Chelsea.
Really?
Yes.
Got some money over there?
Can't buy you love. No, but I can buy a bit of the other.
But in Cathy Come Home, the famous TV documentary in 1966, Jeremy Sanford, Nell Dunn's husband, had a more political message. Cathy and her family need a home. Things go from tolerably okay to bad to worse. By the end, her husband is gone and Cathy's children are taken into care while she screams in futile protest. The nation of TV viewers was duly harrowed.
What was to be done?
Two crucial developments paved the way for the rebuilding of Battersea's housing and the realignment of its economy. The first was the disappearance of the nauseous phenomenon known as the Battersea smell, which seemed to cling to the skin. But the 1960s Clean Air Acts changed all that. The smell and the daily shower of black dust that older residents of Battersea well remember both vanished. In 1968, the last steam train passed through Queenstown Road Station and a nearby office building, previously grimly black, was washed to reveal an attractive red and yellow brick facade. Battersea, without the industrial smells and grime and with its open spaces and great transport links, became much more attractive as a residential environment, although a hidden pollutant from car exhaust fumes has now become a current problem along the main roads. Houses that were once rented out to two families were bought by single-family owners who set about renovating. Long-term gentrification beckoned. A second important factor was a transport victory for local residents and the Battersea Labour Party. In the mid-1960s, Battersea lay plumb in the pathway of the controversial Inner London motorway box. Clapham Junction was to feature as a multiple road interchange between the inner and outer ringways. Labour's MP, Douglas Jay, threw himself energetically into the campaign to stop the box. So he and his first wife, Peggy Jay, who represented Battersea on the Greater London Council, were jubilant when the plan was defeated. The tall figure of Douglas Jay was unmistakable throughout his lengthy 37-year tenure as MP from 1946 to 1983. Patrician in manner, the son of a barrister, he nonetheless lived and dressed simply. He was fond of wearing his old wartime demob suit in navy blue with wide lapels, and as the years went by, he seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of such suits, or perhaps the original really did last a lifetime. In his political career, Douglas Jay especially dedicated himself to stopping Britain's entry into the European Common Market, as it then was. He supported the Commonwealth alternative, but that campaign did not end in victory. His second wife, Mary Jay, recalls,
Douglas fought for the things he believed in, and people always listened because he knew what he was talking about. OK, they didn't always agree with him, but he never got discouraged. And at the end he said, "I've had a good innings."
During these years, Battersea's economy was also being transformed. Jobs on the river barges, in the rail yards, in the power stations, and especially in the heavy industries all began to go. One example stands for many. Morgan Crucible, the giant engineering works founded in Battersea in 1856, moved its business to South Wales in 1970. Thousands of jobs employing men like the father of Labour MP Frank Field were lost locally. On the wall of the Crucible site, the artist Brian Barnes painted a giant mural, named The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, asking who would benefit from these changes. His artwork was much admired, and rightly. Not by Morgan Crucible, however, who demolished the wall in 1979, even while Barnes was balanced precariously on top, howling his protest. Battersea's local economy was reorientating towards services as well as light industries, and while the local population was falling from its high point at the start of the 20th century, new local residents continued to arrive. so Battersea was one of the destinations of the West Indian migrants who arrived on the SS Windrush. They stayed initially in tents and shelters on Clapham Common, but they and their families, and their children's families, like everyone in Battersea, wanted and needed proper homes. Expectations were rising, and in the 1960s both Conservative and Labour governments looked to the local councils to build.
The old Battersea Borough Council was now merged, controversially, into a big new borough with Putney and Tooting. In 1965, Labour won a majority on the new Wandsworth Council, and in the previous year it had won back Battersea South. Its new MP, Ernie Perry, was a bouncy, cheerful, self-made man from a London working-class background who had local council experience. In that, he was a true successor to Caroline Ganley. But the man who really drove Battersea's local government agenda in the 1960s was yet another remarkable Labour leader. His name was Sidney Frederick George Spall, a working-class man who lived in the heart of Battersea, near to Clapham Junction, in the unfashionable Peabody buildings. Sid Spall was a dynamic person whose intensity and drive appealed to activists who wanted to get things done. He wore a smart black suit and drove a flash white Rover 2000. Spall was driven by an ambition to rebuild Battersea, and there was much to do. Even in the late 1960s, thousands of local homes had no inside bathrooms. That was no longer acceptable, if it ever had been.
Spall's record was staggering. In the late 1960s, the council's building programme expanded to a peak of over 1,600 new dwellings a year, mostly in North Battersea, like the Doddington, Winstanley, Totteridge, Livingstone and York Road estates. Interestingly, at this stage, there was very little opposition from the local Conservatives. After all, the real-life Cathys of Cathy Come Home needed somewhere to live, and the old slums of North Battersea were condemned as positively inhuman, to quote one local clergyman. These days, there is much more criticism of high-density, high-rise building, though, ironically, private developers today are building luxury flats on that same principle all along Battersea's riverfront. And the attitude today is more sceptical about large council estates than it was in the 1960s. Spall's legacy is therefore controversial. Furthermore, the massiest system-built Doddington estate had problems from the start. Most notoriously, its sewage backflow problems. It became run down, and it definitely needed its recent bright makeover. Their biggest complaint is not the state of the actual dwellings, but the need for better care of the public environment and better help for residents with social problems.
Spall himself played no part in these later debates. For a time he rode high. In 1968, he was invited by Wilson onto the National Economic Development Council to advise on urban regeneration. And from the mid-1960s, Spall chaired the South London Housing Consortium. Strangely, the Conservatives allowed him to retain this post, even after his electoral defeat in 1968. There were rumours of secret Masonic deals, and disaster followed. In 1971, Spall was jailed on charges of corruptly receiving a bribe. He had been fatally drawn into the orbit of the Newcastle city boss, Labour's T. Dan Smith, and both had got too close to the building contractors. 3 years later, Dan Smith was similarly found guilty. Upon reflection, the misdeeds of these two Labour men in a hurry were not totally surprising, since they were working full-time on council business in the era when councillors received no pay for their efforts. But they acted unwisely and illegally. After his prison term, Sid Spall returned quietly to his unfashionable flat in Battersea, where he died in 1981 at a relatively young age. It was tragic. A lost leader of Battersea Labour who had lost himself.
By the 1970s, there was a new, younger group of Labour councillors, with a majority on Wandsworth Council from 1971 to 1978. These new brooms knew little of Sid Spall, and they generally opposed the high-rise element of his housing programme. So things moved on. The end of the Spall era marked a significant change in the local Labour Party too. Look back to the old photograph of the Executive Committee of the first Battersea Labour and Trades Council in 1908, a photograph incidentally taken by John Archer. Here were the confident leaders of organised labour, with two dogs at their feet. It was the world of the respectable working class, and a male one at that. And for the next 50 years they predominated. See the dignified photograph of the last session of the old Battersea Borough Council. With Sid Spall, there are his allies like Councillor Les Goodwin, who was an electrician, Councillor Bert Harrison, a carpenter and joiner, and Councillor Fred Shaw, who was a foreman with Morgan Crucible. Lily Harrison, who lives on the Shaftesbury estate, remembers well what an instant learning curve it was to marry Bert Harrison and thereby join his family's intense involvement in community politics.
After my Bert was elected for Shaftesbury Ward in 1962, I attended most of the council meetings for 15 years. I became a dedicated party nut. We held jumble sales, garden parties, raffles, knit-ins, dinner parties. Then I helped organise the annual party bazaars. You name it, I was there. It was my life.
The 1971 Labour intake on Wandsworth Council included a large group of new Battersea councillors, all in their 20s or early 30s. John Tilley, a journalist and later MP for Brixton Central. Tony Belton, a computer analyst in local government. Martin Linton, then a journalist and later Battersea's MP. Tracy Tilley, a strong campaigner for welfare services. Guy Wilson, teaching physics at London University. And Penny Corfield, the professional historian who wrote the script. These newcomers were not Battersea born, but they were soon devoted to the area and local politics. The Labour Council in the 70s switched to building low-rise housing as in the Kambala and East Hill estates. It expanded social welfare and funded community resources such as law centres. And Labour pioneered industrial regeneration, with a reminder that Battersea still has a commercial district, as seen in a drive along Nine Elms Lane to the relocated Covent Garden Market. Nonetheless, in 1978, Labour lost control of Wandsworth. Government funding dried up in the mid-1970s. Local rates went up, and Labour went out. And despite getting within one seat of regaining a majority in 1986, Labour then found itself in prolonged opposition on the local council.
London's burning! London's burning!
Now we come to the 1980s and the great political change. It was the time of Thatcherite predominance. The massive community investment in Battersea in the 1960s and 70s had upgraded its environment, removing the worst slums and pollution. In the 1980s, the new political majority in Wandsworth had a different agenda. It was hard for Battersea's Labour councillors to witness the right-wing council dismantle much of what Labour had created.
The Battersea Party remained united throughout the political fallout that followed Thatcher's advent in 1979. Only a few Battersea members quit to join the new Social Democrats. And there was no bitter in-party feuding over militant infiltration, as happened in some places. Locally, Battersea politics remained a contest between Labour and Conservative, as is still the case today, with third parties only rarely winning council seats. And the Labour Party was still winning votes in the general elections. It held both the Batterseas, north and south, and then, when the two were amalgamated into one, it held that until 1987. And it had a popular MP, the Czech-born Alf Dubs. He was suitably internationalist, following in the local Labour tradition of looking outwards as well as inwards. And Dubs had good reasons.
I always get a bit emotional when I think of how Britain welcomed me so warmly, together with other Jewish refugee children who came here on the Kindertransport in 1939, just before the start of Hitler's war. And I suppose because I came to Britain as a refugee, I felt a commitment when I was an MP to do what I could for refugees, for people who had come from other countries around the world and settled and lived and worked in Battersea.
A lot of Labour's passion in the 1980s went into opposing Conservative cuts. For example, Councillor Priscilla Cornwall-Jones, with other Labour Party members, battled to save the run-down but magnificent old Latchmere Baths, built in 1904 by direct Labour and boasting an Olympic-sized swimming pool. But she lost and had to pay a legal surcharge. A group of Battersea women held a sit-in to save the council's Nightingale Lane Day Nursery in 1979, but they lost. Everyone campaigned to save the Greater London Council and the ILEA, but we lost. And some community activists took out an injunction against Wandsworth Council to save Elm Farm, a children's project in the poorest part of the borough. But they lost, and one ill-fated campaigner is still repaying a legal surcharge that was imposed upon her individually.
There were many defeats, which was a depressing state of affairs, and fewer victories, although Battersea, with the entire Labour movement, enjoyed winning the poll tax battle. Among activists, the mood was generally defiant, not defeatist. In fact, the contrast between the rival philosophies of left and right turned 1980s Battersea into an ideological hothouse. The flavour of the era can be read in John O'Farrell's good-humoured account, Things Can Only Get Better. His title said it all. Among Battersea Labour's grassroots was one who later became an MP and went on to higher things, one Tony Blair. He lived briefly in the Fairfield ward in 1979, sharing a flat with Charlie Faulkner. Blair, however, was the exception. Battersea politics did not ignite him, as Anne Crichton recalls.
I was ward secretary when Tony Blair was a member of Fairfield. He sat at the back of the room and rarely said anything. You could have knocked me down with a feather if you told me that 20 years later he would be the next Labour Prime Minister.
Posh Battersea was moving up the social rankings as the air was cleared and the industrial smog and smell disappeared. Homeowners were renovating, loft extensions were rising, wine bars and estate agents were prospering, boutiques and delicatessens multiplied. Lots of young professionals in their 20s and 30s moved into the area, especially into South Battersea.
Some of these changes were good, but the local Conservatives seemed to have no social conscience and no desire to help the low-paid. Keeping the council tax low was just their overwhelming priority. It worked for them politically in that the Labour Party was annihilated in Wandsworth's local elections in 1990 and thereafter.
The people who go into local politics have to make their own decisions as times change. Political parties, like the churches, are voluntary organisations with a high turnover of activists. Campaigning is fun, it's involving, it's comradeship, but it can be pretty exhausting for people with families and jobs. The crucial thing is to have a core of stayers who keep the party flag flying through good times and bad. Plus, plenty of new recruits to bring fresh ideas and energy. Battersea Labour has both.
Another who has stayed within Battersea Labour is Tony Belton. His mother's family was South London railway workers who prospered and departed for suburban Surrey. Tony reversed the move and settled in Battersea. In 1971, he was elected in the local Labour landslide of that year, and he has remained dedicatedly on Wandsworth Council ever since. For 25 of these years, he has been leader of the Labour group, for all but a tiny proportion of the time in opposition to the local Tories.
I know the Labour Party is not perfect, but if we wait for perfection, nothing will ever get done. I believe in principled opposition. The public always deserves to hear the alternatives. Unchecked power for one party is never good, and by arguing the Labour case, we can chip away at halting the worst effects of bad policies.
Battersea Labour had a big renewal in the 1990s. In the spirit of John Burns, Battersea Labour has always avoided getting stuck into impossibilist positions. Within the party, it supported Blair's campaign to remove Clause 4. With lots of new young supporters, Battersea Labour did very well in the 1997 election, winning the seat with an impressive 10% swing against the Tories. The MP, Martin Linton, who was chair of Wandsworth Leisure Services Committee, led the first campaign to save the old Battersea Town Hall from being sold in the 1970s, and has just recently campaigned again to save the Town Hall's second career as a leisure centre. The 1997 victory was a real buzz.
Many of the old issues that have been contested over the past 100 years are still here today. The great gulf between the life chances of the rich and poor is something that Labour activists in Battersea or anywhere else can never accept. And there are many new issues.
Battersea has many more trees now than it had 100 years ago, but it needs to go greener yet. And there are real environmental issues around the rebuilding of the Battersea waterfront. Conservatives used to object to the high-rise building of council estates in the 1960s. But today, the high-rise, high-density boom of private flats is happening with positive Conservative approval. And what about the decaying wreck of Battersea Power Station? A Grade 2 listed building that is known everywhere, yet left to crumble for over 30 years since it began to be decommissioned in 1975. Talk about a lack of proper planning and the failure of the unaided market to find an answer.
Yes, there's masses to do. Of course, the Labour agenda changes over time. That's bound to happen because society changes too. But we keep our core values. I've lived in the area for 40 years, and I've talked to lots of people. They don't want everything planned for them, of course they don't. But they do want investment for the community. The sort of things that the market won't provide, like youth clubs for kids on the estates.
The Battersea parliamentary seat remains a political battleground. Of course, that gives a good challenge to all Labour activists in these challenging times.
And there has been great anxiety over Iraq, as Tony Blair has become, if not a lost Labour leader, then certainly a departed one. But as the history of Red Battersea shows, politics is about change. It's the red rose, alive and growing. It's the mental strife that William Blake advocated to build Jerusalem.
So the campaigns continue, and the parties afterwards. Battersea Labour Party has a proud tradition.
It's got members across the spectrum, with workers, trade unionists, professionals, teachers, actors.
Goodness, what was I wearing?
Some city dealers who hate inequality, and one hereditary peer. Above all, Battersea Labour has got a cause. It is striving for the core values that the pioneers fought for. Not a devil take the hindmost free for all, but freedom with fairness, freedom with social justice. It's always work in progress.
Politics, people often criticise, but really politics is about how people make choices.
It's thinking about other people as well as yourself. It's how we make a good city.
Come on, let's get on with it.
Not for me, not for you, but for us, for everyone in Battersea. Battersea, Battersea.
Thank you for listening to me so attentively, and I hope we shall see you again.